Thanks for the warm welcome. It's great to be here and to speak to you guys. I was here about a year ago, almost exactly, I think, and talked about the foundations of science and how we see evidence for God at the deepest levels of science. And Pooty asked me to speak on, kind of dive down deep into one area that I shared about a year ago, and that would be what is known as fine-tuning. So this definitely is at the foundations of science, and we're going to kind of look at the fundamental laws of nature and how they show evidence for design. So this is something I'm pretty excited about, just to mention a bit about my background as well, in that even though I grew up kind of in a Christian home and was doing pretty well for many years in my walk with God, I did go through a period of doubts about 20 years ago, and so a lot of it was kind of science related. Why are all these smart scientists, they don't believe in God? Where's the evidence? And it really led me to study a lot, and it's what has kind of led me into this even as a ministry now, as I found good answers to the questions I had and just saw that there really is so much evidence out there that people are just not aware of. And in particular, this evidence is something that scientists didn't even know if you go back far enough. Like when I was born, no one really knew about fine-tuning. It's something that's happened since then anyway, which is a lot newer than other parts of science anyway, although I am kind of old. But anyway, one interesting quote we'll lead off with here by Paul Davies, and he's sort of an agnostic physicist, but he says, "The really amazing thing is not that life on Earth is balanced on a knife edge, but that the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly." And so that should kind of get our attention to hear that coming not from a believer, but somebody that doesn't really necessarily believe in God. It's just noticing that there's something very fundamental going on at the very foundations of science. So basically what we'll do here, we'll go through some philosophical considerations, and we'll look at these coincidences that turn out to be necessary for life. And then we'll look at we'll kind of show how this can serve as an argument for the existence of God, and then we'll look at objections at the end. But I like to kind of preface it before we get into this too much, because in my own struggles with faith in the past, I think I overemphasized science. So even though I think there's a lot of evidence for science, I want to mention, just kind of balance things out, that sometimes science is overrated as a way of knowing God or evaluating whether God exists, things like that. So suppose there were no scientific evidence for God, would that disprove his existence? If we had absolutely none, do you think there could still be rational to believe in God, or would that be something that bothers you guys? What do you guys think? I mean, I've kind of showed my hand already on this, but so you could have other reasons for believing in God besides science, obviously, right? I mean, there's a lot of good philosophical arguments for the existence of God, various kinds of moral argument, the cosmological argument, but there's also a lot of evidence from the Bible, actually, fulfilled prophecies. When it speaks of places like Babylon that would be destroyed and never be rebuilt again, how could they have predicted that, so long ago before the fulfillment? So there's just a number of things that I think would point us to, hey, there has to be a God to explain this world that we find ourselves in. And none of this, even, you can go beyond arguments and evidence, the changed lives, the personal experiences that many of you might have as your main evidence for God. Those are, that's justified as well. But I think it does help if you learn a few things that as you're speaking, I know some of y'all are going to be doing evangelism later. If you have a few things that you can share with people, like, hey, here's some evidence from science. You can tell your atheist that you're talking to or whatever that there's reasons for belief, and sort of approach it even on what they already respect in terms of evidence. And notice if someone claims that science has disproven God, then there's kind of an implicit assumption there. Because they're assuming that science would be the only way to know God. And really what they're saying is that, hey, we don't have enough evidence from science for God, therefore God doesn't exist. They're really mistaking because they're not allowing for these other ways in which God can reveal himself. And so it's too limiting. It's sort of like sawing off the branch they're sitting on, right? They're putting all this emphasis on science, but science itself can't show you that science is the only way to know things. That doesn't make any sense. It's a sort of self-refuting. So claiming that science disproves God is no more warranted than claiming a metal detector can disprove the existence of, say, plastics. Obviously, it's good at detecting metals, not so good at detecting nonmetals. So there's no reason to think that just because you have a metal detector out there and it's not pinging, that there's not some plastic, whatever, buried under the dirt. It just doesn't tell you that. So science is designed to detect natural causes, not supernatural ones. But nonetheless, despite that, I think we have pretty good reasons from science for belief in God. So I think I'll show you this video to kind of kick things off. It just kind of summarizes everything I'm going to say in a pretty neat way. We can kind of explain and unpack what's in this video after that. All right. So by the way, there are a number of videos like that, fairly short videos that deal with some of the other arguments for the existence of God or say the evidence for the resurrection. So you might want to check that out at reasonablefaith.org. Got some good videos there. So yeah, the basic claim here then is that in the set of possible physical laws, the parameters and initial conditions, if you look at all possible physics that could have been for the universe, the subset that permit life is just a tiny, tiny, tiny subset. There's a lot more ways that it could have gone wrong for the possibility of life anywhere in the universe than there would be ways to actually have a universe with beings like us. And so it looks rigged in a very incredible way. And by the way, the physicists, the scientists they quoted from there, all of those, and I hadn't really noticed that before in watching this, but I noticed that all of those are not believers in God. At best, they would be agnostics, people that are not sure. Or maybe like in the case of Fred Hoyle, he started off a real hardcore atheist, but after studying some of this, he was pushed into some kind of belief that there's maybe a higher power. So yeah, this quote is by a friend of mine, Dr. Luke Barnes. He's one of the top experts on this subject. He's written a Cambridge University Press book called A Fortunate Universe. And he's also written the most comprehensive article that summarizes the evidence out there. So he read over 200 articles in the physics journals and he summarized them in this very long review article actually, and just captures just a lot more examples than were mentioned in the video or we have time to go through. And the really interesting thing about this is that this is not at all controversial. The physicists that have studied it, they all agree, yeah, the universe is fine-tuned. The only debate is like, okay, does it necessarily point to God? And a lot of them admit that it really looks like it. That's the natural conclusion. But some of them opt for the multiverse, and we can talk more about where they go with the evidence. But the amazing thing is that, everybody agrees that the impression of design is overwhelming, as Paul Davies said. And so I think we have a very natural argument here that points to God from science. So just to mention a few examples at the level of laws of nature. So even the laws themselves, it's interesting that, there's 4 fundamental forces. If you take away any one of those, then you don't have the possibility of life. You need gravity, electromagnetism, these 2 nuclear forces, or you don't have life-permitting physics. One example, you guys may have heard of quantum mechanics, this physics of the very tiny, if you will. Without that, it turns out that atoms aren't even stable. They would decay in like 10 to the negative 14th seconds. The electrons would just go into the nucleus through the attraction with the protons. But it's only because we have quantum mechanics that you have chemistry and therefore life. Without a certain aspect of chemistry, the Pauli exclusion principle, all the electrons would go to the lowest orbital level. So if you want to spread them out and do interesting things in terms of forming molecules from atoms, you need this special principle as well. Gravity is really important. If you don't have that, you don't really form structures, because it's the long-range force that acts on everything in the universe. And in fact, if it was repulsive rather than attractive, you wouldn't have any structures. In fact, it's interesting, Our density is 30 orders of magnitude denser than the average density in the universe. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but it's kind of interesting. If everything was just kind of uniformly spread out, it would be very spread out. There wouldn't be much interesting things to work with. You wouldn't have many particles per space. There's other things. We'll kind of gloss over a few things on the slides for sake of time. But yeah, it turns out aspects of the nuclear force are important. If you change the way electromagnetism works so that like charges attracted and opposites repelled, that would also ruin things for life. So at the level of the laws, there's at least 24 things like this. This is just a few examples. And so even if you just said you have a half a chance for each of these, you're dealing with something like 1 in 16 million chance of getting the laws right. But maybe this, you could still maybe argue that maybe we just got lucky somehow. It's just the way it is. But I think when you look at the other things, when we start looking at the initial conditions and the parameters and how finely tuned they have to be, then there's really no hope for chance, just like the video argued there. So let's talk about the initial conditions. Note that initial conditions are not the kind of things that could evolve. You could never have an evolutionary explanation for initial conditions, right? So according to the Bible, the universe did have a beginning. Different people might have different views of when that is. For our purposes, we don't even care today when that was, although I personally am fine with the old ages. I don't see a conflict with Genesis myself. But even if science was wrong about that, the fact is that whenever it happened, there had to be very, very special initial conditions to the universe for life to be possible anywhere. And this one's actually even the most improbable of them all. One physicist, this guy is like second to Einstein on the theory of gravity, but he said it's 1 in 10 to the power of 123. So just to write out that number would involve more zeros than you have subatomic particles in the universe. And that's just writing it out in standard notation. So this is just a mind-boggling level of precision. And I think there's even applications in some of this. You think about what looks random, God can use and have purposes behind. It might look random how particles are arranged, but it turns out they have to be very carefully arranged, pretty evenly spaced and separated in the initial state, but not too much. They can't be perfectly distributed in some pattern either for there to be life. So this is kind of an interesting clip speaking to how Penrose said the precision of the Big Bang was greater than that needed to blow up a pile of rubble and obtain a fully formed building complete with desks, chairs, and computers. So think about that. That just doesn't make any sense, right? So you could have something like that, an explosion look backwards, but it's a comparable level of improbability. So it's almost, almost every physical constant that you've heard of. We're talking here about the ones at the most fundamental level. So a lot of things in physics you might learn about might be dealing with derived parameters. But we want to go back to the very most foundational level, like what is the charge and the mass of electrons and protons, or say even the quarks that make up protons and neutrons, and look at their properties. And all of those pretty much have to be incredibly fine-tuned for there to be life anywhere in the universe. We're not just talking about life here on Earth or something like that, but these are the way the universe is set up, the way it works. You can also think of this as like if you're writing a video game or something and you're setting up, there's you have your own version of physics in a video game, right? Sometimes you can fly off one side of the screen, go to the other, you have certain properties. How hard would it be to come up with something that could have intelligent life embedded within it? It turns out to be rather difficult. So yeah, all the forces, there's other parameters you might think, well, why would that matter? But the speed of light turns out to matter as well in terms of fine-tuning. And a lot of these are not fine-tuned just in one way, for one life-permitting criteria, but in multiple ways. So for example, for chemistry, it might need to be that protons have to be a lot more massive than electrons. That actually turns out to be true. But it also comes into play for, if you want long-lived stars, the fusion reactions are very sensitive to the masses of those particles. And so you start messing with it, you mess up both of them. So it's amazing that we have any overlap at all in those finely tuned parameters. Yeah, the fine-tuning of the particles that make up protons and electrons have to be just right. And just to mention, as the case with most fine-tunings, it's not just like there's one physicist who's written an article on it. Most of them are affirmed by like multiple articles by not necessarily Christian scientists who are doing this analysis, and it seems to be very clear-cut. So in the case of these quark masses, you change the masses, you wouldn't even have stable protons or neutrons, and therefore no atoms, no chemistry, no ability to form interesting compounds. Because basically everything around us is made of chemicals, right? It's like you can make incredible diversity of things just from protons, neutrons, and electrons. I don't know if y'all have ever stopped to think about that, but it's mind-boggling when you think about it, right? Think about like Legos or different things. Maybe you grew up playing with building blocks. You can only build certain things with those. Yeah, you can do some kind of interesting things, but you can't make human beings out of Legos or things like that. Now, of course, as a Christian, I think there's a non-physical component, the soul, to humans as well. But nonetheless, the physics of ourselves is just made of protons and neutrons and electrons. So this fine-tuning of the quarks is about 1 in 10 to the 35th power. And we threw around a lot of big numbers on the video. And so I came up with an analogy that I think can help people get their minds around just how improbable these numbers are. So the probability of getting the quark masses right to support life turns out to be about the same as if you took a giant sand pile covering all of Asia and Europe up to the height of the moon, and you took that just one grain of sand, colored it red within there, and then you had somebody draw one grain at random, one red grain of sand. And it turns out to be about the same odds of getting these quark masses right. So, I mean, if that doesn't blow your mind, and this isn't even the biggest fine-tuning. I mean, we mentioned the one on the initial conditions as being much, much bigger than this, for example. And I've actually underestimated that a bit on the height. There's a similar level of fine-tuning associated with forming stars that will live a long time. And this was one that I did mention last time, but I'll go through just real briefly here. So if you want life, you do need a stable energy source. Like, just think about how people are so worried about running out of usable energy on Earth, right, with fossil fuels and so forth. But if you didn't have the sun, you'd really be in trouble, right? You wouldn't be able to overcome thermodynamics to do interesting things at all if you don't have an energy source. And when you think about the nature of a star, it's really kind of incredible, isn't it? Because it's a nuclear bomb held together by gravity. And if you think about the kinds of bombs that humans build, yeah, we can fuse atoms together or divide them, but they're very quick reactions, and it just, you have this explosion, and the energy's gone in just a flash, and you have all these harmful byproducts. So how is it that we have a sun that can last 10 billion years and give us a very consistent energy source? Very, very consistent. I mean, yeah, there's some concerns about global warming, and some of that's probably man-made, and some of it is probably natural variation in the sun, but the amazing thing is how consistent our sun is. And by the way, it is way more consistent in its output of energy than our other stars. It's actually not an average star in many different facets that are helpful to Earth. But really the focus of my talk here is more at the level of the laws of nature. So the interesting thing is that the human body actually, in the metabolism that we do, we actually release more energy than does the sun if you divide it by a unit mass. So if you look at sort of the energy density that's released, we actually put out more. The sun obviously puts out way more energy, but it's way, 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 way bigger than we are, right? And so it turns out if you divide the energy of the sun by its mass, it's not putting out that much energy. It's actually, in fact, the photons, the light particles that are released in nuclear reactions in the core take thousands of years to get to the surface. There's all these factors that are coming together to slow down the energy release of the sun. And that's a good thing because that makes it last really long, it makes it stable, and it gives us that stable energy source. So this one is about the same level of fine-tuning as the quarks. It's one reason I like to group them. You can think of the sand analogy here too. So we had to get lucky and draw the red grain of sand to get the quark masses right, the particles that make up protons and neutrons. Well, it turns out we had to do the same thing again. We had to draw from this huge sand pile, get the one red grain again in order to get long-lived stars. All right, and I just throw this quote in briefly to show you that it's not like I'm coming up with my own numbers or something. You have very well-educated physicists like this guy Lee Smolin, PhD from Harvard. He was the head of a research institute of physics in Canada called Perimeter. And he actually puts the numbers more improbable than I do. I try to follow Luke Barnes and use pretty conservative estimates on some things. But he says just to have stars at all in the universe, he puts at 1 part in 10 to the 229th power. So that'd be 1 with 229 zeros after it. So that should get the attention of the skeptics that think there's nothing special about our universe. Even Stephen Hawking, the well-known atheist that passed away relatively recently, and he wrote a book, by the way, called Grand Design. And he was kind of trying to argue against God in various ways, but I found it interesting that he named the book Grand Design. He did have a sense of the awe of nature. And I think that is what it's speaking about in Psalms 19 that was quoted earlier in the video. The heavens are telling the glory of God. We can all sense when we look up, maybe in a place where you can actually see the Milky Way looking up or see the stars, there's something transcendent that gets our attention as we gaze at the heavens. But the interesting thing is that even at the level of, if you study the math and the physics down at a detailed level, you also see an even more exquisite design behind the entire universe. So Stephen Hawking, even as an atheist, he very much affirmed the fine-tuning. He said things like there would be no heavy elements in the planets if the weak force was slightly stronger. He mentions all these things that have to be just right for life. No carbon or oxygen. You could mess that up easily. I'm realizing I don't have a lot of time. I want to leave some Q&A time. Carbon, by the way, is very special, and there had to be very special things happening in physics to permit carbon. So this shows like the number of compounds you can make with hydrogen and other elements, and so it gets up to like 60, 65 or so for nitrogen. Well, carbon, turns out, you couldn't even fit it on the plot. There's 29,000 of them, so it'd go about a quarter of a mile over to the right if you actually drew that on there. So there's something very special going on with carbon, and it's very improbable. I'll skip this next one, but there's another one called the cosmological constant. It's fine-tuned to at least 1 in 10 to the 90th power. And my friend Luke Barnes has been doing some peer-reviewed research on that recently, and he's kind of firmed up that number and shown actually that the multiverse, this theory of other universes, is not a good explanation for this fine-tuning. It's a little bit technical, but if you want information about that, I can talk to you afterwards about that. So the summary is that many of these fine-tuning cases are out there, and it's to a mind-boggling level, and that it's not just it's the initial conditions as well as many of these different parameter values, the constants governing the laws of nature, as well as the laws. And there's almost no physicist that studied this and just totally tries to dismiss it. There actually was one guy, but he passed away a few years ago, and other physicists showed some problems in some of his claims. He got the science wrong. And the fact that you have to have multiple life-permitting criteria in order to have a universe right for life. So this is just kind of showing that the value in our, I don't know if you can see that green light there, but this is kind of showing in this plot, the value in our universe is the vertical line there, and all these constants have to intersect with that, otherwise you don't have life. So if you got just one of them wrong, like over here, that would totally mess up things for life. But it turns out that none of them are wrong. But how is it that we even have this coincidence that there is a life-permitting region at all, with all of these coincidences required? So in summary, the way that you would go from this very solid evidence for physics to an argument for God is to, one way to do it, there's actually more sophisticated ways that I think are a little better, but this is the easiest way to understand. It's just to kind of break it down. It was either due to the laws had to be that way, okay, that would be like necessity, or they didn't. And if they didn't, you're either like, okay, we got lucky, or they were designed. Some combination of those could also be the case, but it boils down to just those three options pretty clearly. And then there's good reasons for thinking that there's no underlying law driving all these constants to a particular value. Indeed, that's what's captured the attention of physicists, is that we have to just go out and measure the strength of gravity, the G in these equations. There's nothing more fundamental that's driving that, and if there was, it would still be remarkable that you have these same coincidences. It wouldn't really do away with the need for an explanation. And obviously chance just looks like a lousy explanation here that we just got lucky. And so that just leaves design as the only other option. And then you think in terms of, well, okay, if there's some designer that's setting up the laws of nature and they're changing things like the speed of light and the mass of the electron, that's pretty powerful. It's really hard to think of like an alien being who themselves is some kind of physical creature that would be able to do that. That doesn't make sense. I think the logical thing to think is that the most plausible explanation of a designer at this foundational level would be God. Now, you don't get a lot of details about the creator or the designer of the universe. There's plenty of other arguments and evidence that can deal with those aspects, but it certainly poses problems for the person who believes that nature is all there is. There seems to be something rigged in nature itself. There seems to be a purpose. I don't know if y'all have seen the movie Dumb or Dumber, but there's kind of a funny clip here that relates if you think about chance as an explanation.
What do you think the chances are of a guy like you and a girl like me ending up together?
Well, Lloyd, that's difficult to say, and we really don't...
Hit me with it. Just give it to me straight. I came a long way just to see you married. Just least you can do is level with me. What are my chances?
Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Isn't that great? That's kind of how I feel sometimes when I've actually shared this, with a lot of different venues, and sometimes, I'll have skeptics that just say, "Oh, I just think we got lucky," and I kind of think about this video as like, this is only 1 in 1,000,000, right? And we're talking about 1 in 10 to the 90th power and things like that. It's not. I wouldn't want a worldview that makes me rely on that level of luck. And thankfully, we have this other evidence for God as well. So yeah, there's a lot of objections to the fine-tuning argument, I think, that fail. In fact, one of the interesting things, and I brought this book here, is that I mentioned I have the friend that wrote this book with this top university publishing group, Fortunate Universe, Cambridge University Press, but he actually co-authored it with an atheist. So that's kind of interesting. So he and the atheist agree, because my friend is a Christian, Luke Barnes. So they agree on all the physics. Most of the book is about the physics, but the last chapter, they look at implications. But I think there was like one footnote where they had a tiny disagreement about one aspect of the physics, but basically they totally agree on everything. And in fact, the atheist also, he was right there in arguing against a lot of popular level objections to the fine-tuning, where people say, well, we just got lucky, or there's only one universe, you can't draw any conclusions from that, or well, we can only find ourselves in a life-permitting universe, so there's nothing to explain. They shoot down all of those kind of popular level objections. And at the end, the atheist does opt for the multiverse. And of course, Luke Barnes says that God is the best explanation, and he lays out a really good argument for that, I think. So yeah, that is the interesting thing too, is that the physicists are sort of forced to appeal to unknown, unseen universes out there in order to explain our universe. Often in the past, there's been, a lot of scientists complain like, oh, you Christians, you're appealing to this unseen entity, God, to explain things, and we should always just explain things based on what we see around us. Well, now they realize they can't do that. They can't explain the fine-tuning by appeal to anything within our universe. And we actually have never detected any universes other than our own. There's no evidence for these other universes out there. Even if you had other universes, you would still need a way to change the laws in each one of them that itself didn't require fine-tuning. And that's where Luke Barnes' recent research shows problems with the multiverse in explaining some of the fine-tuning. So there's a whole host of problems with that theory anyway, but the interesting thing is that skeptics will appeal to those kinds of things. It's more of a metaphysical, it's sort of at the same status of God. Although God, we think we have evidence, he's intervening in this universe. These other universes are causally disconnected from our own, so that in principle you wouldn't even have ways of detecting them within our universe, at least in most versions of the multiverse theory. All right, so I'd like to open it up for questions at this point and see if you guys have any specific questions, or if you want to talk about a couple of the objections, we could do that in the last few minutes here. Yeah.
I had a question. You were talking about one of the popular level theories being that some people just say this is just how things are.
Yeah.
And I was curious, like, what like you said that your friend and his co-author kind of poked holes in that. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that more.
Absolutely, yeah.
The most convincing.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I didn't believe in
Sure. Yeah, I could use the slide on that one, I guess. Here it is. So this is called the Entropic Principle, and there's a lot of people that have discussed this. And so the basic claim would go something like this: well, there's nothing really to explain here, because we could only find ourselves in a universe that permits life. Observers can only observe a life-permitting universe. And that's true, but it's not really a causal explanation. There's still a need to explain the fine-tuning. It's still surprising. And I think a good way to understand this, there was a philosopher named John Leslie that first came up with this analogy. And there's other similar ones that have convinced most physicists of this. But consider if you were put before a firing squad, you had 100 trained marksmen at point blank range firing at you, but they all miss. Okay, would you just dismiss it and say, well, if they hadn't missed, I wouldn't be here to think about it, so there's really nothing to explain? Or would you be like, wow, this is kind of weird, I wonder what's up with that? So yeah, the situation itself demands a deeper explanation. I mean, if you had enough firing squads, eventually maybe they would all miss. But we only know of one universe. So this does intersect with the multiverse, because that's where some physicists would say, we agree it fails on one universe, but if we have enough universes, maybe there is an explanation bound up with this, if that makes sense. But actually, one of the interesting things too is you could actually look at the bullet pattern on the wall behind, and you could maybe get some information. Were they missing on purpose, or did they just happen to miss? Because if they're really trained marksmen, there's like an error ellipse. They're probably going to barely miss you, right? If they're really aiming for you and they're really good marksmen. In the scenario that there's a whole bunch of them and you get lucky, it's kind of barely missed. But if they're actually told by their boss to miss on purpose or something for this particular person, then they're probably going to aim a little bit away so that in case they miss, they won't kill you. In the same way, physicists actually look at these fine-tuned constants and they ask the question, is it more finely tuned than is necessary? And that's what Luke Barnes was finding, for example, with this cosmological constant. Is that a lot of these things are way more finely tuned than is necessary. And so yeah, this objection has zero force if there's one universe, but if you combine it with the possibility of many other universes, then it's at least a candidate explanation. And so that might be why there is a sense in which that could be part of the story. But it doesn't do anything for you unless you know that if you have independent reasons for knowing there's a lot of firing squads, then maybe it could help. But if that happened, it would still be more likely that they missed on purpose than that you just got incredibly lucky, even if there's a multiverse of these kind of firing squads going on. All right, other questions? Yeah.
How do you all go about your research? Do you all make simulations and see what would happen if it's adjusted? Or?
That's a good question. Yeah, I should clarify. I myself, I'm not like a fine-tuning researcher, but Luke Barnes is, and I do talk to him a lot, read his work, as well as reading works of people of all backgrounds. I read the articles. But yeah, I mean, part of it, for example, the research I was mentioning about the cosmological constant, there they really did some supercomputer simulations. They asked the question, if you change this parameter a little bit, how does that affect galaxy and star formation? And so they were able to show that, yeah, it starts having a really big effect once it gets, over about 1 in 10 to the 90th was like the super conservative version of it. It would probably ruin things well before that. But many of the other parameters, for example, you could determine, what's holding the nucleus of an atom together is a strong nuclear force. You've got protons in there, right? They're repelling each other. They're all positive charges. How is it they can stay together? Well, they stay together because the strong nuclear force is stronger than the electromagnetic force. So you don't have to do a simulation for that. You can just say, well, we know if it was a little bit stronger, it would ruin it. So some of them are in that category where it's a back of the envelope, easy calculation. A few of the other ones are more complicated, but most of them are fairly straightforward, actually, to kind of bound it. All right, other questions? Yes, sir.
Have you read Astrophysics for People in a Hurry?
I have not. That was the one by Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Yeah, he's one that talks somewhat about some of these kinds of things, and I think has some misleading things to say on fine tuning. But yeah, I probably should read that, so I'm aware of what he's got, what he's trying to argue and deal with. Yeah, I've actually got a YouTube channel, by the way. It's called Finely Tuned Universe. If you want to dig deeper, I've got interviews like with Luke Barnes, Dr. Michael Strauss, an OU physics prof who contributed to the Higgs boson, as well as some of my own talks and kind of summarizing information on there. So that might be another resource. This is a good book. I recommend reading if you really want to dig in real deep. You could go with that. Yes?
Does the fact that the universe is finely tuned tell us anything about God specifically, not just that he exists?
For one thing, I think it shows that he wanted to leave evidence. There would have been ways maybe he could have created a universe without fine-tuning. One of the complaints against God by skeptics sometimes is why is God so hidden, right? Why doesn't he leave more evidence? Well, here's an example where he left very, very strong evidence. I mean, just mind-boggling levels of improbability. And it's interesting you still have people kind of denying that and pushing back against that, which shows that often there's more going on than just the intellectual side. But I think it does show that God wanted to leave evidence in multiple ways. Yeah, he probably knew, well, he definitely knew we wouldn't discover this until many years later. Many people lived before they knew there was fine-tuning evidence. But he has all these, he has a wide variety of ways to reveal himself to people, some of them experientially. But I think it's interesting that it shows that he didn't leave himself without a witness, even to the most intelligent, educated scientists out there. Yes?
You said that you, a few years ago, or 20 years ago, you went through, some doubts, and you said you got answers to those questions. How did you go about, getting answers to the first few questions and, not being so...
Yeah, great question. I wouldn't say I necessarily went about that the ideal way, because I think I should have, the interesting thing is that if someone goes through that today, it's a lot easier to get help on that, I think, than it used to be, because there's a lot more apologetics-oriented research or writings out there that you can point people to. But I did do a number of reading books, talking to people, and it helped. But I think I should have done more to reach out to people. But I just didn't. Part of it was I didn't know who to talk to. Whereas today, people know about, say, Lee Strobel, and then he interviews certain experts. You could kind of track down pretty easily who are the top Christian thinkers that might be able to give an informed defense against skeptics and things like that. Or you have people like Frank Turek that came here recently, making that more accessible to people, explaining it, popularizing it. So yeah, I mean, if it happens to someone today, I think there's a lot of organization, they can go online to Reasonable Faith or Ravi Zacharias Ministries, different places to get a ton of resources. There's something called Apologetics 315, which summarizes the resources from a lot of other Christian groups. And so I would say if it had happened to me, if I was in a different time period, it would have been a little bit easier. But I think I should have done more at trying to go to people within the church. But I just didn't know anybody that knew much about science in my church at that particular time, and I didn't know where to get help. But Yeah, and if someone is here that's having doubts, I'm happy to give you my business card and try to help you myself with any questions that you might have, anything that's bothering you, because I really am convinced there's great answers to the tough questions. And I don't claim to know all of them, but I know where to look better now, at least. I know, if you have a question about certain philosophical things, there's a certain place you can go to get really good answers. Or if it's science related, you can talk to people like my friend Luke Barnes, and he's got just an incredible amount of knowledge. He's invited to fine-tuning conferences, and yeah, they actually have conferences about this, trying to unpack, what does it all mean? And they talk about the implications, and they talk about the multiverse. They talk about all this stuff. It's really fascinating. But they invite Luke to go there and speak, and they recognize him as one of the top experts. All right. Well, any last question? Or we're about out of time, so thank you for attending, and I'll be around afterwards if you want to talk any.